Hello and welcome to By the Book, a podcast from ASCO featuring compelling perspectives from authors and editors of the ASCO Educational Book. I'm Dr. Pedro Barata. I'm a medical oncologist at University Hospital Seidman Cancer Center and an associate professor of medicine at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm also the associate editor of the ASCO Educational Book. We know that in recent years, the oncology community has increasingly prioritized the need to modernize clinical trial eligibility, reduce patient burden, and enhance diversity in trial participation. On that note, today we'll be speaking about ways to enhance access to clinical trials with Dr. Ravin Garg, as a hematology oncologist at Maryland Oncology Hematology, and also assistant professor of oncology at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Dr. Garg is also the co-author of a fantastic paper in the ASCO Educational Book titled Practical Guide to Clinical Trial Accessibility, Making Trial Participation a Standard of Care. Dr. Garg, welcome. Thanks for being here and congrats on your paper.
Thank you for having me, Pedro. Excited to be here.
Your paper is a wonderful multidisciplinary piece that actually features perspectives from the different stakeholders, right? The patient advocacy, the industry, the community practice, the academia on these oncology challenges in making trials more available. This podcast is a wonderful platform. It reaches out to a lot of folks within our community. So I'll start by asking you the obvious. What do you think it's a must read for our community, for our listeners?
So Pedro, thanks again for inviting me. You do a great job with these podcasts. So I think first and foremost, oncologists right now are under a lot of stress, just in terms of clinical volume. There's concern for research money, how we get the best care for our patients. So I think this article is very important because it helps bring together, as you had mentioned, the stakeholders throughout academics to community practice and everywhere in between, and try to find how, as a team with different oncologists who partake in different aspects of oncology, can come together to streamline the process to try to get our patients on trials, or certainly have them have availability of trials, just if they're interested in going on them. And being in practice, we've had several challenges that we can talk about throughout this podcast. But I think it's a very important paper because it recognizes that at the end of the day, it takes a team effort for all of us in academics, community, industry, pharmaceuticals to really come together as a team to really help put forth the trials for our patients.
So from the perspective of a community oncology, how do you put together, or maybe can describe some of the challenges you see to increase trial participation in the community?
Yeah, Pedro, it's a great question. And it's something that I keep on thinking about and trying to find ways to be better at it myself. But I will say some of the challenges as a community doctor that I've seen for myself and talking to other colleagues. Number one, I do think there's a lot of stress on doctors in the community in general, Pedro. Oftentimes we're tasked to seeing a wide smorgasbord of patients. So we may not have the luxury of being a specialist in any particular tumor subtype. Like oftentimes we'll have to see lung cancer, the next one will be breast cancer, the next one could be CML, the next one could be thrombocytopenia. As you know better than I do, Pedro, the field in each one of these disciplines is changing so rapidly. Molecular genomics, radioligand treatments, different imaging tests, MRD testing for some of our heme malignancies. And I think one challenge we have in the community is just keeping up with the basics of Oncology 101. In the process of doing that, it can be very difficult to sometimes remember that we have very exciting trials available for our patients. So I think a lot of it is the day in and day out of being an oncologist is so taxing at times that oftentimes a research trial is not the first thing in our headspace when we see a patient. I think number two, Pedro, at least in the community, and perhaps this is with academics too, is that we're bombarded, I would say, by a lot of messaging these days. Like we have in baskets to go through, labs to go through, things of that nature. And in the process of a patient visit, seeing them, doing an exam, taking a history, trying to go over the NCCN guidelines and best practice for how to manage their care, at least for me at times, it's very hard to remember, hey, there might be a great trial available, whether within our network or maybe partnering with an academic center. So getting through a day can be fraught with a lot of peril and just difficulties, I would say. And I would say number three, Pedro, at least as, I'm in a private practice where I do see a wide range of benign malignant hematology and solid tumors. So I wouldn't call myself a specialist. And I think a challenge with that, at least for trials, Pedro, is that when you're a specialist or perhaps you're focusing on a couple of disease subtypes, you become more of an authoritative voice in those types of tumors. And you might be more aware of the trials within your network or perhaps in proxy with an academic center that you can offer your patients. So I think when sometimes we spread ourselves too thin, it can be very hard to be a thought leader, if you will, in a particular subtype of a malignancy, let's say, and maybe not be aware of a trial that could be really well suited for your patient. In terms of ideas that myself and colleagues have had in terms of helping mitigate against some of these, I'd say, setbacks or issues in the practice for trial enrollment, some of the things we've talked about, Pedro, is number one is we do partner with academic centers. So we live here in Maryland. We have several really fantastic academic centers. So oftentimes, not just within our practice of Maryland Oncology Hematology, we have a lot of great trials available here too, for certain. But in addition to that, we'll oftentimes work with doctors at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, in Maryland. If they have a compelling trial that we don't have within our network, it's really of the patient's interest, Pedro, to reach out to them in a collaborative manner to see if they have a trial that might be really compelling for your patient. So I do find myself collaborating a lot with colleagues in talented like yourself in academics. I think you do a lot of GU malignancies. So as an example, partnering with colleagues who are GU experts and say, hey, we have a patient with stage 4 renal cell. These are the standard options, I know, but any trials that you might have available. I think the other thing that has been very helpful for us is having navigators within research, Pedro. As an example, what's really helped the uptick of trial enrollment for our center in Annapolis is having a research navigator, because oftentimes what they can do is a priori, Pedro, before you see the patient and you're kind of formulating standard of care treatment plan, perhaps. They might tug you on the shirt and say, hey, we have a great trial here through a Sarah Cannon, or there might be something else out there. And being aware of that when you go into a patient's room really provides a nice arena, if you will, to go and hear the standard of care is here. But hey, we have a trial option that might be well suited for you, maybe perhaps even better, that we can talk about too. So having research support in the community is really a huge boon, I think, Pedro, for us to really increase our enrollment for patients onto trials.
Yeah, I really love that, Ravin. So let me switch gears a bit. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about patient advocacy, because they do play a huge role in cancer and they address many barriers. How do you think we should leverage the patient advocacy groups to reduce patient burden and maybe have them really leverage patient advocacy to improve representation in clinical trials? What do you think we can do more?
Well, Pedro, I think they're very critically important. As a clinical oncologist now, and I would say this is for anyone in the field of medicine, you're exactly right. I think patients are bombarded by information. There's a lot of things online, whether it be TikTok, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, and people are really just have a lot of information given to them. And some of it is fact driven and some of it's not, Pedro. And oftentimes, I do think there can be at times a mistrust with some medical personnel. I think we're in an era where we're seeing that to some degree with some attributes of medicine. And I think of it as an opportunity for education for the patient and for myself as a physician. And I think patient advocates, to your point, which was well taken, serve as a bridge to both. And what I mean is that, patient advocates are wonderful. They're, I think, outstanding communicators. They almost are a neutral party, Pedro, where many patients feel that they're an independent source of information that is free of bias, if you will. They are there to provide support, emotional support, scientific support for patients so they can make an informed decision. So, in terms of our practice right now, patient advocates is something that we are evolving in that capacity, I would say, Pedro. I think now more than ever, having more people as bridges of communication with care providers, along with patients, is of critical importance. And I would venture a guess, and I think this has been published, where patient advocates really can help tremendously in familiarizing patients with trials and what they're all about, and maybe clear up some misconceptions of what the mission of trials are. Because I do think some patients, at least I've had a few over the years, where when they hear the term trial, they almost think they're being experimented upon, when in point in fact, they could really help advance their care. That messaging along the way for some may be mixed up a little bit. And so I think patient advocates is a really great way to offer more information for patients with a source they find very independent and trustworthy, if you will. And it can really help expedite and I think make a more fruitful conversation for care providers, whether academic or community. And they might be more open-minded in terms of enrolling onto a trial.
Wonderful. Yeah, I agree. I agree with you completely. So let's focus a little bit now on the folks designing the studies. We usually call them the sponsors. It might be an academic sponsorship, if you will, but we can also have pharma being the sponsor of a study. The angle from academic design, it's not necessarily the same as what happens when we have pharma. And from that angle, how do you think a more inclusive research can be promoted?
Oftentimes with trials, I think keep them simple as we can. And what I mean by that is oftentimes for trials, Pedro, even for care providers who are enrolling, it can be daunting when there's a lot of different things involved, particularly, let's say, for investigator sponsored, which are incredibly brilliant science, incredible. But it can be a little bit daunting for patients and even the referring physician to talk about getting translational specimens, imaging, traveling to certain centers to get scans and biopsies and even different diagnostic testing like PSMA testing for, prostate cancer. And it can, I think, be very intimidating for patients in terms of what might be required of him or her to enter onto a trial. Like, this is not what I signed up for. This is laborious. This is a full-time job for me. Do I have to pay for parking to go to a city? Do I have to pay for these imaging tests? And do I have to stay in a place for my family to enroll onto a trial? So I think keeping trials as simple as possible, but yet call the data we need as investigators, where we can really advance the care, hopefully get approval for a drug, but also learn more about the medication and how it works for a patient. So I think simplifying language for trial is very important. I know when I've gone over studies for patients, Pedro, if it's a voluminous amount of information, they can right away get very intimidated. Like, oh my goodness, this is like a term paper for a college again. I'm joking. But keeping language simplified is very important. I think number one, and I feel that sometimes when they're asked to do a lot of different diagnostic testing, which is very important for translational work, I 100% understand. But I do think sometimes patients can get a little bit off put, if you will, and frustrated with the whole process of doing it. The second thing for our patients, Pedro, that they have mentioned to us when we put them on trials, not just within our own site, but elsewhere, is that it takes a lot of time in terms of collecting information, perhaps a washout period from their last standard of treatment prior to enrollment onto a study. Many patients, Pedro, as you know better than I do, are in maybe crisis in terms of their health and their cancer might be growing, promulgating out of control, and they worry about not being able to expeditiously start onto a treatment, onto a trial. So that can lead to a lot of frustration. And one thing that you brought up, which was outstanding for me, is the enrollment criterion for some of our patients is felt to be somewhat strict. We've had some patients who may have had a remote history of a stage 1 malignancy that was by all accounts in remission, let's say 4 or 5 years in the past. And the risk of recurrence at this point would be incredibly low, but they may not be able to enter onto a study because of some stringent criterion put forth. And that can be a little bit frustrating. In fact, I've had 1 or 2 patients who, as an example, with kidney issues, but the GFR was about 60, like right near a cutoff that oftentimes, as you know, we use, whereby you can get into trial or not. And, if they're 58 as an example, and otherwise they're a picture of health, great candidate for a trial that will likely advance their care. And if the entry criterion is too stringent, that might be lost opportunity for all parties involved, all stakeholders, if you will. I do appreciate the criterion for entry onto studies cannot be too liberalized. You have to have a certain baseline. But there is a little bit of a gray area and tension of sorts, if you will, if a patient has a comorbid illness that is a disqualifying offense, but in practicality, perhaps it shouldn't be, especially if they're motivated and there's an opportunity to really advance their care. We have run into, not often, but sometimes in the past, I should say, where patients have been very off-put because we try to get them onto a study and there may have been a particular feature or attribute in their underlying care that they couldn't get onto it. So I think having a little bit more thoughtfulness, perhaps, in terms of entry criterion, practicality, if you will, I think would really help enrollment onto studies.
Really well said. Is anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners before we wrap up the podcast today?
I would say, just macroscopically speaking, it's really an honor to be an oncologist. I think I speak for both of us. Anyone listening who is thinking about the field, it is tremendous. Just the research, the bravery of our patients and the thoughtfulness of our scientists like Pedro and translationalists and clinical trialists is really awe-inspiring. So I've really loved this field. I will say from a trial perspective, we really need to enter as many patients as we can onto trials because the science is so brilliant now. The genomic underpinnings of the tumor, we're making great strides as a team of clinicians and scientists, translationalists. So the more that we can get people onto trials and get approved drugs, it's going to help them out in the end. So I think it's such an important time for all of us to come together as a community, find the best way to help our patients out. And clinical trials have to be at the forefront of how we continue to advance care for our patients.
Yeah, no, Ravin, I really agree with you. We really need to increase access to clinical studies. And actually, your paper is a great step in that direction by raising awareness, bringing up solutions. And again, collaboration is really a multidisciplinary effort to accomplish that. Thank you so much for sharing your fantastic thoughts and insights with us.
Thank you, Pedro. You do a wonderful job with these podcasts. I'm really honored to meet you and to be part of this.
And thank you to our listeners for your time today. I encourage you to check out Dr. Garg's article in the 2025 ASCO Educational Book. We'll post a link to the paper in our show notes. And please join us again next month on Buy the Book for more insights on key advances or innovations that are shaping modern oncology. Thank you for your attention.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.